I didn't know the exact moment my marriage truly ended would arrive quietly, carried into my life by a stranger with a calm voice and a folder pressed tightly against her chest. There was no screaming phone call, no lipstick stain on a collar, no late-night confession whispered in guilt. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, inside my family's flagship electronics store, the place my parents had built from nothing, brick by brick, long before I ever knew what betrayal felt like. I was reviewing inventory reports when she approached me. She looked composed, not angry, not frantic, just resolved. "My name is Jennifer," she said gently. "I'm Felix Peterson's wife, and I believe we need to talk." In that instant, my life split cleanly into before and after. I'm Amelia, 30 years old, a mother, a daughter, and, until that afternoon, a woman who believed she was living inside a solid marriage. I'd been married to Theo for 5 years. We had a 3-year-old daughter, Zara, who still believed bedtime stories could fix everything. Jennifer didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult me. She simply opened her folder and placed it on the counter between us, like evidence in a courtroom. Text messages, hotel receipts, photos taken in parked cars, and dim restaurants. And then the emails. That's when my hands started to shake. Because this wasn't just about an affair. It was about money, my parents' legacy, my daughter's future. According to those emails, my husband and his boss had been planning for months, mapping out accounts, discussing how to move my inheritance into joint access, laughing about how trusting I was, how easy it would be once everything was in my name and his. I remember the hum of the air conditioning, the faint smell of polished metal and electronics, the way my heart thudded so loudly I was sure Jennifer could hear it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I thanked her. And when she left, I stood alone in that store, surrounded by everything my parents had built, and realized something terrifying. The man I loved hadn't just betrayed my heart. He had tried to steal my daughter's future, and that was something I would never forgive. Before Jennifer walked into my store with that folder, my life looked enviably normal from the outside. I was 30, juggling motherhood and the family business like so many women do, quietly, efficiently, with a smile that masked how tired my bones felt most days. My parents had built our high-end electronics and home automation chain in the 1980s, starting with one tiny shop that smelled like solder and ambition. Growing up, I learned that money wasn't magic. It was work. It was sacrifice. It was my father's hands cracked from carrying boxes, my mother's feet swollen after 12-hour shifts, and the way they still came home to help me with homework as if they had endless energy. By 16, I was working weekends in the stores, stocking shelves, wiping fingerprints off display screens, learning how to talk to customers who wanted perfection. I didn't get special treatment just because I was their daughter. If anything, I was pushed harder. "If you want to inherit something," my mother used to say, "you should understand what it costs to build it." Then I met Theo. It was our final year of college. A mutual friend dragged me to a party I didn't want to attend. Too loud, too crowded, too full of strangers pretending they weren't insecure. Theo was there, leaning against a kitchen counter like he didn't belong either. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He had this calm, steady presence, soft eyes, an easy smile, the kind of voice that made you feel like you could breathe deeper. We talked about nothing important at first. Classes, music, the weird pressure of adulthood creeping closer, but then he asked questions that felt real, about my family, about the business, about what I wanted to be, beyond the daughter who inherits. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Theo came from a solid middle-class family. His dad was a teacher. His mom worked part-time at a bank. He didn't have my background, but he wasn't bitter about it either. If anything, he seemed impressed by the grit behind my parents' story. When we started dating, I watched him step into my world with a smoothness that made my parents relax. He laughed at my father's jokes. He helped my mother carry groceries without being asked. When my mom taught him our old family recipes, he acted like it was an honor, not a chore. I mistook that for character. After we married, Theo encouraged me to keep growing in the business. He said he admired my work ethic. He said he loved how I cared about employees like they were family. We built a life that felt balanced, weekend breakfasts, late-night movies, little traditions that made marriage feel less like a contract and more like a home. Then we had Zara, and Zara changed everything in the sweetest way. She made me softer, but also sharper, protective in a way I hadn't expected. My world became smaller and more precious. Her tiny hands on my cheeks, her laughter when Theo spun her around the living room, her sleepy voice saying, "Mama," like it was the safest word in the world. But beneath that warm surface, there were signs I didn't name at the time. Theo started working later, not constantly at first, just enough to be normal. He began dressing better, buying shirts that fit a little too perfectly, cologne I didn't recognize. When I teased him, he'd kiss my forehead and say, "I just want to keep up at work." And then, the conversations. He started asking questions about our finances in a way that sounded practical, but left a strange aftertaste in my chest. "Wouldn't it be easier if everything was joint? Don't you trust me? Why does your sister have so much control over the business side?" My sister Lena, 2 years older than me, MBA, razor-sharp instincts, was the only one who seemed uneasy early on. She had modernized half our operations and could smell manipulation like smoke in the air. "She's very interested in the money," Lena warned once, carefully. Like she didn't want to insult the man I loved, but couldn't lie to me, either. I defended Theo. Of course I did. I told myself Lena was overly cautious. I told myself marriage meant trust. I told myself that wanting to combine finances was normal. I didn't want to see the truth. And then last year, my parents died in a car accident, killed by a drunk driver on the highway, and grief cracked my life open like a dropped glass. Theo held me while I shook. He attended lawyer meetings with me. He spoke softly when I couldn't form sentences. He looked like a devoted husband. But now, looking back, I can't stop thinking about how comfortable he seemed in those meetings, how closely he watched the paperwork, how easily he learned the numbers, and how quickly, after the funeral flowers wilted, he began pushing for access. Because maybe, just maybe, he wasn't supporting me through grief. Maybe he was studying the locks on the vault. Grief does something strange to time. After my parents died, days blurred together in a fog of legal documents, sympathy casseroles, and nights where I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying my last lunch with them, my mother laughing, my father teasing me about working too hard. Theo stayed close during that period. Too close, in hindsight. He positioned himself as my anchor, my translator to the world when I felt numb. He attended every meeting with the estate lawyers, sat beside me, hand on my knee, nodding thoughtfully, as if we were equal partners in something that had never been meant to include him. At first I was grateful. Then the questions became sharper. What's the timeline on accessing the inheritance? Is there a way to simplify how the accounts are structured? Does Lena really need that much control over the business side? He always framed it as concern, efficiency, protection for our family. But the more he asked, the more I noticed how his attention lingered. Not on me, not on Zara, but on numbers, on policies, on what belonged to me and how it could become ours. Around the same time, his work schedule shifted dramatically. Theo had been promoted to a more visible role at Peterson & Morris, one of the biggest law firms in the city. His boss, Felix, was demanding, charismatic, and powerful in a way that made people orbit him. Theo started coming home later, sometimes past midnight, smelling faintly of unfamiliar cologne and hotel soap. When I asked, casually at first, he said cases were piling up, that Felix leaned on him heavily, that this was just how it is when you want to succeed. I wanted to believe him. But my instincts, those quiet alarms I'd learned to trust in business, began whispering. Theo became protective of his phone. It was always face down, always locked. He stopped leaving it on the counter while showering. When I picked it up once to check the time, he stiffened like I'd crossed a line. "I need privacy," he said, defensive. "Work stuff, confidential." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Then came the finances. Theo suggested we move my inheritance into our joint account for simplicity. He said it wasn't healthy for married couples to keep money separate. When I hesitated, he accused me of not trusting him, of treating him like an outsider in his own marriage. I tried to explain that my parents' lawyers had structured everything carefully for a reason, that Zara's trust fund was protected, that some things weren't meant to be flexible. Theo didn't like that answer. His tone changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. Less patient. More insistent. "Don't you want us to feel like a team? What if something happens to you? Why does Lena get to make these decisions instead of me?" Lena noticed it too. After one business meeting, where Theo had insisted on sitting in, Lena pulled me aside. Her voice was low, controlled, the way it always was when she was deeply uncomfortable. He's asking the wrong questions, she said. Banking access, account structures, things he has no business needing to know. I brushed it off again, because brushing it off was easier than admitting my marriage might be rotting from the inside. But the tension didn't stop there. Theo started criticizing Lena openly, calling her controlling, accusing her of wanting to push him out of his rightful place in the business. It felt personal, resentful in a way that went beyond professional disagreement. At home, he grew distant from Zara, not cruel, just absent. When she asked him to read bedtime stories, he'd say he was too tired. When she ran to him with drawings, he'd smile without really seeing her. And yet he had endless energy for work, for texts, for whatever waited on the other side of that locked phone. The night before everything exploded, I lay in bed listening to him type messages in the dark. The glow of his screen reflected off the ceiling, flickering like a warning light. I remember thinking, if I ask him who he's talking to, I'll shatter something I'm not ready to face. So I stayed silent. I didn't know that the truth was already walking toward me, holding a folder, wearing a calm expression, about to change everything I thought I knew. The moment Jennifer stepped into my life, everything slowed down. Not in a cinematic way, not dramatically. It was the kind of slow that makes your body react before your mind catches up, your pulse loud in your ears, your fingers tingling, your vision sharpening around details that suddenly feel dangerous. She stood across from me in the showroom, surrounded by glass cases and soft lighting, like a woman returning a purchase that didn't meet expectations. Her posture was straight, her hands steady. There was no rage in her eyes, only exhaustion and resolve. "I won't take much of your time," she said, "but I think you deserve to know." She didn't ask to sit. She didn't soften the moment with small talk. She placed the folder on the counter between us, opened it carefully, and turned it so I could see. The first page was a photograph. Theo, smiling, leaning into a car window that was not ours. The second page was a hotel receipt. My name wasn't on it, but his was. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the counter to keep my balance. "I found out 8 months ago," Jennifer continued, her voice steady. "I needed time to be sure, and then I needed proof." She flipped through pages slowly, deliberately. Text messages printed in clean black ink. Intimate jokes. Complaints about work, about marriage, about me. I saw my name reduced to a problem to be managed. She doesn't need to know yet. Once the money's moved, it'll be easier. She trusts me. Each line felt like a thin blade sliding under my skin. And then came the emails. Jennifer hesitated for the first time before turning those pages. Her fingers tightened on the paper. "This," she said quietly, "is why I'm here." Theo and Felix. Planning. Discussing inheritance structures. Joint accounts. Trust limitations. One email made my vision blur. Once everything's combined, it won't matter who originally earned it. It'll all be marital property. They joked about timing, about grief, making people less detail-oriented, about how I'd been too emotional to think clearly after my parents' deaths. I remember the sound of the air conditioner humming, the way a customer laughed somewhere behind me. The ordinary world continuing, oblivious, while my marriage collapsed in silence. I didn't cry. That surprised me. Instead, my body went cold, sharp, focused. "How long?" I asked. Jennifer met my eyes. 8 months. 8 months of lies at my dinner table. 8 months of kisses goodnight. 8 months of my daughter asking where Daddy was while he stayed late for another woman. "And the money?" I asked. Jennifer exhaled slowly. "They hadn't accessed your inheritance yet, but they were trying." I nodded. Once, because nodding was easier than screaming. She told me she was divorcing Felix, that she didn't want revenge, just the truth out where it belonged, that she'd debated coming to me for weeks. "I kept thinking," she said, softer now, "if it were me, I'd want to know before it was too late." I thanked her. That part shocked us both. When she left, I stood there alone, the folder still open, my reflection faintly visible in the glass of a display case. I looked older, sharper, like someone who had crossed an invisible line. I didn't go home right away. I drove. No destination, just movement. My hands shook on the steering wheel, but my thoughts were terrifyingly clear. That night, I didn't confront Theo. I met with my parents' lawyer instead. He reviewed everything, emails, receipts, messages, and confirmed what I already suspected. The trust funds were protected. Zara's future was safe, but any money moved into joint accounts would be vulnerable. "Act quickly," he advised, and quietly. So I did. I transferred my personal funds out of our joint accounts, leaving only what was needed for household expenses. I changed passwords, locked access, called a divorce attorney, and scheduled a consultation. By the time Theo realized something was wrong, it was already done. He called me at work that evening, his voice sharp, unfiltered. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I can't access the account." That was when I told him. Not everything, just enough. And when I hung up, my hands finally started to shake, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing the life I'd built was gone. Because betrayal doesn't explode, it seeps. And once you see it clearly, you can never go back to not knowing. Shock isn't loud the way people imagine. It doesn't arrive as screaming or sobbing or dramatic collapse. For me, it settled in my chest like a heavy stone, dense, unmoving, while the world kept functioning around it as if nothing catastrophic had just happened. Theo came home late that night. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the house dim except for the soft glow above the stove. Zara was asleep upstairs, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin the way she liked. Everything looked painfully normal. Theo walked in, dropped his keys harder than usual, and went straight to the sink. "You locked me out of the accounts," he said, not even looking at me. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What's wrong?" Not, "Can we talk?" Just accusation. I turned in my chair slowly. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My voice was, too. "I met Jennifer today." That did it. He froze. Just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. His shoulders tightened. His jaw clenched. The silence stretched between us, thick and electric. "She showed me everything," I continued. "The messages, the hotels, the emails about my inheritance." Theo laughed then, a short, disbelieving sound that felt rehearsed. "She's lying," he said quickly. "She's jealous. Felix and I are close, that's all. She's trying to ruin—" "Stop!" The word cut through the room. I stood up. "I've already spoken to the lawyer who handled my parents' estate. I've already confirmed what's protected and what isn't. And I've already seen your emails." The color drained from his face. For a moment, just a moment, I saw fear flicker there. Then it turned into anger. Instead of apologizing, instead of collapsing into regret, Theo stepped toward me like he was gearing up for a fight. "You had no right," he snapped. "You humiliated me. You cut me off like I'm some criminal." I stared at him, searching for something. Remorse, shame, recognition of what he'd done. There was nothing. "I protected my daughter," I said quietly, "from a man who was willing to steal her future." That's when he changed tactics. He blamed me. He said I'd been distant since my parents died, that I buried myself in work, that Felix understood him in ways I didn't, that he felt invisible in my shadow, married into a family he'd never truly belonged to. "I deserve support," he said. "I deserve security." I felt something crack then, not loudly, but cleanly. "You deserved honesty," I replied, "and instead you chose betrayal." He scoffed. "You act like money isn't the real issue here," he said. "You've always kept it just out of reach, like a test I could never pass." I thought of my parents, of my mother's tired smile, of my father's hands. "You didn't fail a test," I said. "You revealed who you are." That night I asked him to leave. He refused at first, said it was his house too, said I couldn't just throw him out. I told him about the evidence, about the copies, about the lawyer, about what would happen if this went to court. He packed a bag without another word. After the door closed behind him, I sat on the floor of the kitchen and pressed my forehead to my knees, not because I missed him, because I was grieving someone who never really existed. Over the next few days, reality set in. I reviewed bank statements and felt sick. Tens of thousands gone. Hotels, shopping, gifts I'd never seen. Money that could have gone to Zara's education, to our home, to anything real. I didn't tell Zara everything. She was too young. I told her daddy was staying somewhere else for a while and that mommy loved her very much. She accepted that with the fragile trust of a child. But at night, after she fell asleep, I lay awake asking myself the same question over and over. How long had I been ignoring my instincts just to keep my marriage intact? And worse, how much damage had I almost allowed because I wanted to believe in the man I married? I wasn't angry yet. I was recalibrating. Because once a woman realizes she's been played, she doesn't explode. She sharpens. And I was just beginning. The fallout didn't come all at once. It came in waves, each one more disorienting than the last, until I realized this wasn't just the collapse of a marriage. It was the exposure of a pattern that had been quietly unfolding behind my back for years. The morning after Theo left, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Missed calls, voicemails, texts that shifted rapidly from rage to self-pity. "You're overreacting. We can fix this. Think about Zara. You're being cruel." I didn't respond. Instead, I met with my divorce attorney. She was calm, precise, and unflinching, the kind of woman who had seen every version of betrayal and didn't romanticize any of it. She reviewed the evidence, nodded once, and said, "You did the right thing acting quickly." That sentence felt like oxygen. Then she asked the question I hadn't fully prepared for. "Do you believe he would have stopped if you hadn't caught him?" The answer sat heavy in my chest. No. And that was when things escalated. Theo didn't retreat. He regrouped. Within 48 hours, his parents called. His mother cried on the phone, saying she didn't understand how things had gotten so bad. His father spoke in clipped, disappointed tones about working things out privately. They urged forgiveness, minimization, silence. "This doesn't have to ruin your family," his mother pleaded. But it already had. Then came the friends. Mutual acquaintances who suddenly felt entitled to opinions. People who didn't know the details but were eager to smooth things over for the sake of comfort. Everyone makes mistakes. He was grieving too. "You don't want Zara growing up in a broken home." Each comment chipped away at my patience. Because none of them asked what it felt like to realize your husband had been mapping out your financial destruction with another woman. And then there was Lena. My sister showed up at my house unannounced one evening, groceries in hand, expression unreadable. She hugged me once, tight, wordless, then started unpacking food like she'd done it 100 times before. "I knew," she said finally. I looked at her, startled. "Not about the affair," she clarified, "but about the money, the way he watched, the questions he asked, the entitlement." I felt a strange mix of relief and regret. "I should have listened," I said quietly. She shook her head. "You trusted your husband. That's not a flaw." Theo, meanwhile, was unraveling. He showed up at the house while Zara was at preschool, demanding to talk. When I refused to let him in, he accused me of turning his daughter against him, of being vindictive, of trying to punish him. "I supported you through your parents' deaths," he shouted through the door. "I earned a place in that money." That sentence told me everything. Earned. As if grief were currency. As if marriage were a transaction. Things reached a breaking point when Theo's boss, Felix, was fired. Not quietly, not gracefully. The law firm uncovered months of fraudulent expense reports, tens of thousands charged to client accounts, hotels, shopping, trips disguised as business travel. Theo hadn't known everything, but he'd known enough. And once Felix was exposed, the affair became impossible to hide. Jennifer reached out again. She told me Felix had tried to throw Theo under the bus to save himself. She told me he'd lost everything, his job, his marriage, his reputation. It didn't bring me satisfaction. Just clarity. Theo showed up one night after that, wild-eyed and desperate. He admitted the affair fully then, admitted the planning, the spreadsheets, the jokes about how easy it would be once I trusted him enough. "You were never supposed to find out like this," he said, as if the problem were the timing, not the betrayal. When he realized there was no path back, his tone shifted again. He threatened me. He said he'd fight for custody, that he'd tell the court I was controlling with money, that he'd paint me as cold, career-obsessed, emotionally distant. I didn't raise my voice. "I've been documenting everything," I said calmly. "Every message, every call, every expense." That stopped him. The final blow came when I discovered he'd emptied a separate college savings account we'd started for Zara, money outside the protected trust. Nearly $25,000 gone. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "I needed legal fees," he said flatly. "You left me no choice." That was the moment something hardened permanently inside me. Because stealing from me was one thing. Stealing from our daughter was unforgivable. I filed for full custody the next day. The escalation didn't just expose Theo. It stripped away every illusion I'd built around who he was. And in the wreckage, I saw myself clearly for the first time, not as a betrayed wife, but as a woman standing between her child and a man who would burn everything to avoid consequences. I wasn't scared anymore. I was done. People assume the darkest moment in a story like this is the discovery of the affair. It isn't. The true breaking point comes later, when the shock wears off and you're left alone with the wreckage, trying to figure out how much of your life was real and how much was performance. For me, that moment arrived quietly, on an ordinary night, after Zara had fallen asleep. The house was too still. No footsteps upstairs, no television murmuring in the background, no second toothbrush in the bathroom. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the empty space where Theo used to sleep, and felt the weight of everything settle fully into my bones. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about identity. For years, I had defined myself in relation to others. Daughter, sister, wife, mother. I had believed that if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, protected my family fiercely enough, things would hold. But love hadn't protected me. Trust hadn't protected me. And now my daughter's world had been cracked open by choices she didn't make. That night, Zara woke up crying. She padded into my room with her blanket dragging behind her, eyes half closed. "Is Daddy mad at me?" she asked softly. My chest collapsed inward. I gathered her into my arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, her warmth grounding me in reality. "No, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady despite the ache. "This has nothing to do with you." She nodded like she understood, but she didn't. How could she? She was 3. She curled into my side and fell asleep, trusting me completely. And that was when I broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Tears slid silently down my face as I held my child and realized how close I had come to letting a man like Theo control her future. The custody hearings loomed ahead like a storm. The financial cleanup was relentless. Calls with banks, lawyers, credit agencies. Every day brought new reminders of what Theo had done. Debts he'd hidden, accounts he'd tried to manipulate, lies layered so carefully I wondered how I hadn't seen them sooner. I questioned myself constantly. Was I too focused on work? Did I miss signs because I wanted stability too badly? Had my parents' deaths made me vulnerable in ways I didn't recognize? And worst of all, had I taught Zara that this was what marriage looked like? Sleep became fragmented. I lost weight without meaning to. My reflection in the mirror looked sharper, harder, like someone who'd aged years in weeks. Theo didn't make it easier. He oscillated between rage and desperation, one moment threatening legal action, the next begging for another chance. He sent messages saying he missed Zara, then followed them with accusations that I was poisoning her against him. Every message felt like a reminder that no matter how carefully I tried to move forward, he still had the power to reach into my life. The lowest point came the day my attorney called and said we needed to prepare for the possibility of supervised visitation. "It's not guaranteed," she said gently, "but courts move cautiously." The idea of handing my daughter over, even supervised, to someone who had stolen from her future made me physically ill. That night, after Zara was asleep, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off. I thought about my parents, about what they would say if they could see me now, about how fiercely my mother had protected me, even when it meant making difficult choices. And I realized something painful but freeing. I had been so focused on surviving this that I hadn't yet accepted the truth. My marriage wasn't something to grieve. It was something to release, because clinging to the idea of what I thought I had was keeping me trapped in the worst moment of my life. The darkness wasn't just about loss. It was about standing at the edge of a future I didn't recognize, and wondering if I was strong enough to build something better from the ashes. I sat there for a long time, listening to the house breathe, until dawn crept through the windows. And as the light returned, so did something else. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic revelation or a perfectly timed confession. It arrived with evidence, cold, methodical, unarguable. 2 days after that sleepless night, my attorney called me into her office earlier than scheduled. Her tone was different. Focused, almost cautious optimism threaded through her professionalism. "We've received additional documentation," she said, "from Jennifer." Jennifer, Felix's wife, had decided to submit everything she had to her own attorney as part of her divorce. And because Theo's name appeared repeatedly in those communications, copies were now legally shareable. What she handed me felt like the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't known was still missing. Spreadsheets. Not casual notes, not vague ideas. Actual planning documents. Theo had helped Felix draft timelines, access points, risk assessments. They'd discussed when I would be most vulnerable emotionally, how grief could be leveraged, how moving money temporarily into joint accounts would create permanent entitlement. One line stopped me cold. "Once she trusts me enough, it's done. She won't even notice until it's too late." I didn't cry. I felt something else instead, clarity so sharp it bordered on calm. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was intent. And intent changed everything. The custody strategy shifted overnight. My attorney laid it out plainly. With this level of premeditation, combined with the theft from Zara's college account, the financial abuse, the threats, Theo's credibility in court would collapse. "He didn't just betray you," she said. "He demonstrated willingness to harm his child's future for personal gain." That sentence landed like a verdict. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the power dynamic tilt back into my hands. But the true turning point wasn't legal. It was internal. That evening, Lena came over again. We sat at the kitchen table, papers spread between us, Zara coloring quietly nearby. Lena looked at me carefully. You know this means he'll escalate emotionally, right? When people lose control, they try to reclaim it any way they can. I know, I said. But this time, she added gently, you don't have to manage him anymore. That's when it clicked. For years, long before the affair, I had been managing Theo's feelings, softening my boundaries, explaining my family's choices, making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. And now, even after everything, a part of me still felt responsible for his reactions. I wasn't. I didn't owe him comfort. I didn't owe him access. I didn't owe him forgiveness on his timeline. That night, I set boundaries I should have set years ago. All communication went through lawyers. No more late-night texts. No emotional negotiations. When Theo showed up unexpectedly, I didn't open the door. When he sent messages accusing me of cruelty, I didn't respond. And something unexpected happened. The noise stopped. Not immediately, but gradually. Without my reactions to feed on, his tactics lost momentum. A week later, Zara asked if we could plant flowers in the backyard. She knelt in the dirt, hands messy, humming to herself. Watching her, I realized something profound. I wasn't just protecting her from Theo. I was modeling what self-respect looked like. The court hearing arrived faster than I expected. Theo looked smaller there, less certain. The evidence spoke louder than any argument he could make. When the judge ruled in favor of primary custody with supervised visitation, my knees nearly gave out. Not from victory, from relief. Afterward, standing outside the courthouse, Lena squeezed my hand. You did this, she said. You chose your daughter. And in that moment, I understood the real shift. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. Choosing peace over chaos. Choosing protection over denial. Choosing my child over the fantasy of a marriage that had never truly existed. The turning point wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own life. And once a woman does that, nothing can take it from her again. The truth has a way of echoing. Once it's spoken aloud, once it's documented, verified, and placed under the cold light of accountability, it doesn't stay contained. It ripples outward, touching every corner of the life built on the lie. Theo learned that the hard way. The first collapse came professionally. Within weeks of Felix's exposure, the firm initiated a broader audit. While Theo hadn't stolen client money himself, his involvement in planning and concealing the affair, and his proximity to fraudulent activity made him radioactive. Partners distanced themselves, meetings were canceled, promotions quietly disappeared. The calm confidence he'd worn like armor cracked in public. Then came the social unraveling. Friends who had once urged me to be understanding began backing away from him. Not dramatically, just subtly. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. People didn't want to be associated with someone whose betrayal was documented in spreadsheets and court filings. The narrative shifted. It wasn't a marriage that failed. It was a man who tried to exploit his wife's grief. Theo tried to rewrite the story. He told anyone who would listen that I was cold, controlling, obsessed with money, that I'd shut him out emotionally long before the affair, that he'd felt powerless in a family where he never truly belonged. But stories don't survive facts. And facts were everywhere. The custody ruling hurt him more than he expected. Supervised visitation meant limits, schedules, witnesses. It meant he couldn't perform fatherhood the way he'd perform marriage, selectively, when it benefited him. The first supervised visit was awkward and quiet. Zara clung to me at the handoff, uncertain. Theo smiled too hard, spoke too softly, like a man auditioning for a role he'd already lost. Afterward, Zara asked if she had done something wrong. I told her no. I told her that sometimes adults make choices that change things, and our job is to keep children safe while grown-ups learn from their mistakes. Theo, meanwhile, spiraled. He sent messages apologizing one day, blaming me the next. He accused Lena of poisoning me against him, accused Jennifer of exaggerating, accused the court of bias. Eventually, even his parents stopped defending him. They came to my house one afternoon, faces drawn with a mixture of shame and exhaustion. We didn't raise him to do this, his father said quietly. I believed him. But raising someone and knowing who they become aren't the same thing. As Theo's world shrank, mine expanded. Not socially, not dramatically, internally. I stopped second-guessing myself. I stopped explaining my choices to people who didn't live with the consequences. I stopped framing my decisions as reactions to Theo and started owning them as proactive acts of protection. Lena and I streamlined the business operations. I delegated more, took fewer late nights, learned to step back without guilt. Zara started sleeping through the night again. She laughed more, asked fewer anxious questions. She trusted that home was stable. That mattered more than anything. Theo made one final attempt to regain control months later. He asked for mediation, said he wanted closure, said he'd changed. I listened. Then I declined. Not because I was angry, but because I was done negotiating my peace. The fallout didn't include revenge. I didn't smear his name or celebrate his losses. I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. Theo lost access to what he tried to exploit: my trust, my resources, my future. And I walked away quietly, with my daughter's hand in mine, with my parents' legacy intact, with a life that finally belonged to me again. People expect justice to be loud, but sometimes the most powerful consequences arrive softly, in the form of doors that never reopen, opportunities that never return, and a woman who no longer looks back. Healing doesn't look like forgiveness wrapped in a bow. It looks like distance. It looks like boundaries that don't bend just because someone regrets crossing them. It looks like a quiet life rebuilt on terms you choose, one careful decision at a time. A year after everything collapsed, my days are simpler now. Mornings start with Zara's sleepy voice calling for breakfast. Afternoons are split between the business and school pickups. Evenings belong to us. Books on the couch, backyard dinners, flowers we planted together blooming despite everything. Theo is no longer the center of my story. He exists on the edges, in schedules, in court documents, in the occasional supervised visit. But he doesn't dictate the rhythm of my life anymore. And that's the real victory. I used to believe that strength meant enduring, that if I held things together long enough, they would eventually make sense. I was wrong. Real strength is knowing when to let go, when to protect instead of preserve, when to choose truth over comfort. I learned that betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears the face of a partner who says the right things while planning behind your back. And trust, once broken by intent, not accident, can't always be repaired. But I also learned this. A woman doesn't need to be ruthless to be powerful. She doesn't need revenge to reclaim her worth. She only needs clarity and the courage to act on it. Zara will grow up knowing that love doesn't require self-erasure. That family is built on safety, not obligation. That boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. As for me, I'm no longer afraid of starting over, because I didn't lose everything when my marriage ended. I found myself. And sometimes that's the lesson hidden inside the worst chapters of our lives. When someone tries to take what was never theirs to claim, walking away, whole, aware, and unashamed, is the most powerful ending of all.